Our city is Ho Chi Minh City. So first we're going to start with some background information. The population is about 7.4 million, and this was in 2010. There's also a high migration rate. There's about 200,000 migrants per year. The government has left housing left to market forces. So many of the migrants have found shelter in boarding homes. They're rented share units and they erected spontaneously, and they kind of lacked technical infrastructure or access to public transportation. For the economy, Ho Chi Minh City is only 8% of total Vietnamese population and accounts for more than 20% of the key aspects in the economy. Also, 1/3 of all foreign direct investment is in Ho Chi Minh City. For the hazards, urbanization has increased the risk due to flooding because of informal expansion into wetland and impermeable surfaces. They lack the natural drainage. Future projections for precipitation suggest greater seasonal variability in precipitation. They're rainy seasons from May to November. Of the 322 communes and wards, 154 of them have a history of regular flooding. The projected regular flooding events by 2050 by the Asian Development Bank states that only land higher than 3 meters in elevation will not be exposed to any flooding. So the vulnerability, the low elevation of the land and the heavy rainfall makes the city susceptible to flooding induced by tidal fluctuations. Most of the population and economic activities are concentrated in low elevation coastal zones. The outskirt districts have degraded dikes that no longer can hold the high tides, so they experience regular urban flash flooding. The rural poor will be the most exposed to flooding by 2050 because of their direct dependence on the natural resources that are likely to be affected and their living locations and conditions. The urban poor are very vulnerable because of their geographic location in the city and associated poor housing and environmental conditions. The Department of Natural Resources and Environment is increasing its pollution and environmental quality monitoring activities, has prepared a series of regulations and directives, but these have not been extremely extensive since. They have a centralized government, so they don't have the capability for a quick reaction to climate change. They have to go through a lot of layers. The anti-flooding and storm activities implemented by the City Committee on Flooding and Storm Prevention, they have resettled some vulnerable people.
So what current strategies are being put into place right now? One of the things they're looking at is crop relocation to areas that won't have such high flood risk. In other areas, as mentioned before, this seawalls and storm barriers, but as was said earlier, it's not overly effective in terms of the long-term aspect. Reinforcement of dunes. Dunes are a nice natural way of reinforcing and helping to adapt to the climate change and also to the rising sea levels, which is a risk of flooding. But if it continues to rise, and as you know, sand erodes. So, over time that's going to erode away and have to have maintenance constantly. And reassignment and relocation of transport is one of the strategies they're looking at to areas. Now, the way that we look at these are weaknesses, and because they're short-term, quick-fix solutions. They have a centralized government, so it's a hierarchical top-down approach towards doing things. There's many loops to jump through. There's many forms that need to be filled out. So the government looks at what's in their best interest. So again, it's from an economic standpoint, and also lack of continuous assessment. As I said before, with the short-term quick-fix solutions, you're going to have people need to constantly assess them to make sure that maintenance is properly done on these things.
So there are two things that Ho Chi Minh City urgently needs to do in order to tackle the impacts of climate change effectively and efficiently. What we decided is that the city urgently needs to prioritize its adaptation steps. The only way to actually do that is to have the accurate local data that's downscaled from the global data. So we propose that the first policy should be to reduce remaining uncertainties on the effects of climate change for Ho Chi Minh City and its region. A long-term cooperative scientific research and data collection network between local and regional scientists should be established. Downscaling of the global climate data is needed in order to gain accurate predictions and the future impacts of climate change on the Ho Chi Minh City region, with particular focus on monitoring local water bodies, sea level rise, and the changes in the local ecosystem. The second policy talks about also the second most urgent problem, which is land use and management. As we heard from my two previous colleagues, Ho Chi Minh City is settled on the really low and high flood risk area. And we think that there should be better and more radical strategic land use planning in terms of deciding where future infrastructures are going to be developed and where are people going to be placed in the case there are going to be high hazards or floods. So we propose that the second policy is to develop a new land use and management plan to enforce strategic future infrastructure development in low flood-prone and low-risk areas. Investment reform towards affordable public housing development is needed to provide safe settlements for the ones potentially displaced by the hazards and floods. So what we have here are the summaries of anticipated implementation benefits. And we think that accurate regional flood risk and temperature measurements and monitoring will provide guidelines for effective adaptation mechanisms within all sectors of planning. And that is what the city actually lacks, right? So it lacks accurate data that will provide priorities for tackling the impacts of the climate change. The next one is that strategic land use investment into resilient infrastructure should ensure that the inhabitants who currently live in the high-risk areas are given space to move to safer areas, and that the public infrastructure holds the future risks of climate change, and that all the future infrastructure systems aren't precarious.